Hi and welcome to the start of another reading vlog. I'm just back from my sister's place. I stayed over last night and she did my hair this morning. It just needed a refresh. The roots were coming through and she did a few new layers. And I wanted to start on a new reading vlog because March is Women's History Month and International Women's Day is this Sunday. We've also had like the Future Women's Leadership Summit here in Sydney over the last couple of days, and I was just feeling inspired to read some mainly non-fiction, I think, from women, and I saw that Goodreads put up an article called New Non-Fiction to Read This Women's History Month, and there are so many interesting sounding books in that article. Some that sound like they're just going to make me angry thinking about some of the topics, but yeah, I just thought I would get to reading some of them. So I think I'll do a mixture of any that I can find the audiobooks for, or I'll read the rest on my Kindle. And yeah, I think my plans are pretty chill for tonight. So I might get started on one of those books and I'll check in as soon as I've chosen one. Okay, so I have just been having a look through the list on my laptop and I'm pretty sure I've settled on at least the first book that I want to start reading tonight. And I've saved quite a few from the list. There are so many that sound so interesting. But I think I want to start with All in Her Head by Elizabeth Comen, who is a oncologist. So this one's about the history of women's healthcare, how men have kind of put themselves in a place of authority over women's healthcare, and as a result we don't have enough research and there isn't a lot of care taken in terms of women and our bodies. It sounds like she wants to empower women to learn more about their own bodies and just to understand ourselves. I think this one is going to make me angry just because it's such a personal issue. Like, we've all been through some form of like frustration when it comes to our bodies and how we're treated in the healthcare system. And I don't know, I feel like it could be an interesting one to read. So I'm excited for that. So I'll check in once I am a good way into this book to let you know how I'm feeling. But I'm excited. I'm excited to maybe sit and have a seltzer a bit later and get a bit angry for women's health. To do a bit of a check-in because I've since finished All in Her Head, The Truth and Lies Early Medicine Taught Us About Women's Bodies and Why It Matters by Elizabeth Comen. And I think this might be quite a long update because I have a lot to say. I really enjoyed this. I rated it a 4.5 stars. There are a couple of little issues that I had that I'll talk about in a second, but overall it was pretty easy to read and really interesting, and it also made me extremely angry. So in this, she talks a little bit about learning about your body and ways to treat issues that you might be having. But that was just a really small part of the book. The main thing she talks about is history and the horrific stories that she includes about the ways that women have been mistreated throughout time. The notion of hysteria, which is so angering, and how so many times women's health issues have been linked to anxiety. It's all in her head, and how this still affects women's healthcare to this day. There were a few things in here that I definitely already knew, but I do also feel like I learned a lot about specific people in history, like respected people in science and in medicine, even names that I've heard of, who are still respected to this day and in their time were extremely sexist and racist and created these internalized views. I thought the way she set out the book was interesting. She breaks it up into chapters which each talk about a part of the body. So one on bones, one on muscles, the bladder, reproductive system, hormones, you get it. There were a lot of different areas. But there wasn't one part of the body that didn't have something deeply angering to its history. And one thing to note is obviously this author is American, so a lot of the examples and stories that she talks about in the book are based on American history, but I did find that it was still really interesting, and I feel like there are a lot of similarities. I would like to find out if there are any differences and do a little bit of research into Australians' healthcare history. The author, Elizabeth, is an oncologist, so she does have a personal take on a lot of the stories that she writes about. And I found that really interesting because she has personally seen how these things have affected her patients. We see her speaking to these women patients who are experiencing this shame over being sick, over having to seek treatment, shame for failing to see their symptoms earlier. And after studying medical history, the author knows that this isn't a mystery why women feel this way when it comes to their health and men don't. There's a sense of shame that over the course of the last 1,000 years, and the stories that she shares through the book shows this toxic messaging and manipulation. And through that, we have taught women that if something goes wrong with their sexual health, that something's wrong with them personally. She talks about misogyny in medicine and how this started by women just simply not being allowed to be in medicine, whether it's researching or practicing. And this started way back in like the witch trials, where women who were practicing witchcraft were hunted and murdered. And this led to women obviously being sidelined from medicine because it was simply too dangerous for them to be involved. And then obviously it was no longer a thing to burn women at the stake. But over the next few centuries, women were still sidelined from practicing and even studying medicine. So now, even though there are just as many women in medicine and becoming doctors, the treatment and research behind women's health still doesn't match up, even though we know that treatments interact differently in a woman's body to a male one. One ridiculous thing in history is the history of plastic surgery and how it kind of came to be a thing. It kind of kicked off in the 1940s when soldiers were coming back from World War I with like facial disfigurements, and it was made a priority for this to be fixed because all these men had holes in their faces and disfigurements. And very soon after this, the industry was kind of split into two lines. When people saw an opportunity to start marketing this towards women whose only access to society was being attractive and sexually desirable, so cosmetic surgery was marketed towards them as the difference between having a lonely, unhappy life or being a productive mother and wife. And then on the other side, there were the men whose faces were being fixed in order to get a job. And then this leads to eventually plastic surgeons coming up with breast implants. And I found it pretty interesting that the man who invented breast implants, he originally did it on a lady who was living a life of poverty and had some proper health issues that she needed fixed. And the only way that she could afford this was by going to this doctor who coerced her into also getting her breasts done, kind of as a guinea pig for him. And then when this worked out and he figured out that he could do this, he started on a quest to basically legitimize the need for breast implants by spreading the logic that having small breasts is like a disfigurement and a deformity. And it's ridiculous that this logic that has come from this man who was just trying to make money is something that's still in our mindset to this day. There is misogyny in the form of the research of human bones and even the size of human brains. Obviously, females were viewed as more fragile because of the way that our bones were set out and less smart because of our smaller brains. Even the understanding of Darwinism and evolution led to this way of thinking, and Darwin himself said that women's physiology appeared characteristic of a lower race, and he also believed that the average mental power of a man is above a woman's. And then also to this day, female amputees often face challenges in finding prosthetics that suit their bodies because they just haven't been designed for women. She basically outlines that in so many areas of women's health, things now are better than they used to while still just not being good enough. One of the most horrific chapters, I think, was also surrounding World War I and the soldiers who were contracting sexually transmitted infections, and then essentially women were blamed, of course. But something that I hadn't really heard of was the American plan, which came from the amount of soldiers in the US military who were contracting these diseases. And the plan that came out of this was horrific. It was essentially women were stalked and kidnapped if they had been marked that they were carrying one of these sexually transmitted diseases. But the things that could mark them as disease carriers were literally ridiculous. Like, they could be marked if they were sitting in a restaurant alone, if they decided to change jobs, or if they were just marked as being suspicious. And they were kidnapped, imprisoned, and then forcibly given these dangerous drugs. And if they failed to show proper ladylike behaviour, they would be beaten, doused in water, or forced into solitary confinement. This is obviously extreme and doesn't happen to this day, but there's still, because of this mentality that has been around for so long, research still falls short when it comes to women's sexual health and sexually transmitted diseases. An example that she talks about is that in 2019, a key trial was done for a new HIV preventative, and this studied the effects of this drug on thousands of male subjects, but it purposely excluded females, despite the fact that nearly half of infections globally occur in female patients. Something else that I learned was how important muscle building activities are for women of all ages. Going to the gym to do weights is so important compared to the activities that women have often done to lose weight, like Pilates and walking, and more cardio activities, which have always kind of been more ingrained in us that to get the body that we want, we need to do those activities. But muscle building activities can prevent things like osteoporosis, which is a huge issue in women. And even for women who have just been through menopause, weight exercises are so important for increasing bone density and can even lower the risk of certain diseases. And you know, there were so many more facts about heart disease, the pill, hormones, lungs, the lack of research into concussions in women, and more throughout this book, and about our bodies that just angered me so deeply. But I do like that overall there was hope in this book too. In each chapter she talks about how things used to be and things that have happened in history, and then she relates it to issues that we're currently facing in healthcare. But she also talks about how we have progressed to a point where women are finally being listened to. So overall, I did enjoy this book. It was very information heavy, and I think at times it was longer than it needed to be, but I do feel like it was easier to read than a lot of very information heavy subjects because I was just so interested in what she was talking about. There was one thing that sat with me a little bit funny. One thing I didn't love was a slight transphobic feel in just a couple of pages, but it was really the only time she ever mentioned trans people at all. Through the book, she never states as a doctor her support as an ally, even though transgender people have a lot of issues when it comes to healthcare, and I feel like there could have been so many topics that she could have covered, but that's fine, you know, that wasn't the subject that she was focusing on for whatever reason. But the thing that felt a little bit strange was the only time she did mention trans people, she started the chapter off with a quote from Dylan Mulvaney, a known influencer on TikTok for being a trans woman who has quite controversial takes, and I think she's been cancelled multiple times. The quote that she used from her is pretty condescending towards women and obviously made a lot of people angry, but we know that she's in the minority when it comes to trans women's opinions, and it felt strangely pointed to start off the chapter with that quote and then go into the author's experience when it comes to hormones and gender transitions. So that and the fact that it was just a little bit too long were really the only things that I disliked about this one. So overall, an interesting read, and I am glad that this was the first one that I got into because it's got me feeling quite angry and ready to get right into another one. I think the next book that I want to get into is The New Age of Sexism, which is about AI and technological advances and how they're affecting women and the misogyny that's coming from technological advancement. I have an audiobook of this ready from my library, and I just feel like because All in Her Head really focused on the history of misogyny in women, this one should be a bit interesting because it's looking towards the future, and it might be a bit terrifying in terms of what we are currently experiencing and where we might be heading in social media, in AI, in technology. So I think I might start listening to that today, and I'll check in when I have some thoughts. So I was literally just about to hop on a bus to go to Manly to get on a ferry to go to the city because we're going out tonight, and a huge storm just came in. So on the radar, it looks like it's gonna just pass, hopefully, but I'm just gonna wait half an hour and see what happens to it. But in the meantime, I thought while I'm just at home alone and waiting to leave to go out that I might do an update on the most recent book that I just finished, and I've got a drink just to have while I talk through The New Age of Sexism by Laura Bates. And then the rest of the title is How AI and Emerging Technologies Are Reinventing Misogyny. This was a pretty interesting read. I listened to the audiobook and it did make me thoroughly angry. I think if I'm comparing the last read to this one, there was a bit less in terms of actual useful information in my life. So I'm really glad I listened to the audio of this one. It's narrated by Laura Bates, the author, and you can really hear her emotions through it. You can hear her passion for the different topics she talks about, the sadness in her voice when she talks about things that are happening to these young women online, and the anger that she feels. You can really hear it. Well, the lighting just turned really orange. So while in the last book, I learned a lot about misogyny in our history and in science and in medicine. And there was a little bit of hope that I talked about in my last update, in the fact that science is getting better when it comes to including women in medicine. But in this one, we are much more focused on the future and how technology can affect women and the impacts of AI on society and the way that these incels are using AI is a little bit terrifying. So she kind of structures the book in a way where each chapter is focusing on a specific issue. And the first topic that she really dives deep into is deepfakes, which, if you don't know, this is the technology where AI can completely replace parts of an image, a video, or a voice recording even. And AI can make your face be doing whatever you want it to do. Weirdly, I actually ended up watching an episode of Black Mirror the other night, right after finishing this book, or right after finishing that chapter. And it just happened to be about the dangers of deepfakes in making movies and the dangers of phone surveillance and signing away those contracts that you receive without reading them. It was a good episode. It was creepy. It randomly had Selma Hayek playing herself. She basically gets screwed over by someone who's made a deepfake with her face in a movie. I definitely recommend. But back to the book. An example of how this deepfake technology can be misused that the author talks about in the book is in the small town in Spain, all of these girls were being sent nude pictures of themselves, but they were all fake. They just took their random photos that they found of them on the internet and created these nude photos. And it became a huge issue for these girls. And it's pretty terrifying that this was just done by schoolboys, because the technology to do this is just so easy. There are just apps that you can download that are built to make somebody look nude. There was another example of a similar thing happening in a school here in Australia, in Melbourne. And I'm sure these are just a couple of examples. They would be happening all the time. And she also talks about deepfake porn, which is so disgusting. And I feel like it would be so violating and vile if you found your face on a deepfake video. She also talks about how, I don't know in how many cases this is, but in some of these apps where you can go in and create a nude picture using someone's face, most of the time a man's body or a man's face doesn't even work, because the app's just been created to work with a woman's features. And that's crazy to think about. The demand just isn't there for women to be doing this to men. So it just hasn't been created because there wouldn't be a profit. Okay, I just turned the light on because I feel like the lighting is a little bit better now. I look a bit less yellow. But yeah, what I was saying, what does that mean? What does that show about men in our society? And who are these people and companies who are creating and profiting off of these apps? I obviously don't want to talk about everything she says in the book because you should just read it yourself. But there are just some key points that I wanted to talk about because I just felt so riled up about them. A bit later in the book, she talks about the fact that she has experienced the online abuse against women personally. As a feminist writer, and after writing her first book, she was receiving death threats and abuse online, as well as deepfake photos and videos of her in sexual positions. In another chapter, she talks about the environmental impact of AI and the data centers that are needed to keep them running. I thought I had a decent or kind of an understanding. Obviously, I knew that there was an environmental impact, but I don't think, without knowing the facts about about how much power is actually used. I couldn't fully comprehend it. But yeah, some of the stats she used really put it into perspective. Like, just one thing she said was a single ChatGPT search produces like 10 times the amount of electricity as a normal Google search. She puts a lot of other facts into there which really kind of put it into perspective, but the overall impact is huge. But when you stop and consider how much of this power is being used to satisfy these gross misogynistic predatory men who are using AI to just produce these gross videos and images, it's pretty insane that everyone just acts like this is okay. I don't want to get into this too much, but she also has a chapter dedicated to the metaverse and these virtual reality games where a lot of young people are spending their entire lives online, and in them obviously you can be anyone who you want, you can create any kind of world and do anything you want, which may sound amazing, but there are also some scary sides to that as well. There are so many cases of assault, groping, and even rape that happens inside the game, but that's not even talking about the cases where these adult men have stalked young women outside the game, and there are even cases of girls being kidnapped in real life. As messed up as the online assault is, it's causing real life assault as well. The stat that she uses about something like every 7 minutes an assault happens in one of these games, it's so crazy. The author, she does a lot of research, I notice. Like, she actually goes out and uses these VR games, and in a few of the other chapters on like sex dolls or these sex rooms that you can go to in Amsterdam, she actually goes and visits them. But yeah, she spends a lot of time in one of these VR games just for research purposes. And in her first time online, it only takes her 2 hours of playing before she witnesses a sexual assault happen to someone else in a public setting. That is wild to me. She also talks about sex dolls in a whole lot of ways, but the one that really got to me was these companies that are selling and profiting off sex dolls that look and are the size of children. I feel like I don't even need to talk about how awful this is, that these companies are profiting off of normalizing child abuse. I literally have notes because there were so many facts that I was taking out of this audiobook. On a lighter note, but still serious, there are companies that started implementing, and it's probably happening a lot now, companies that are implementing AI in the recruitment process, in scanning CVs and filtering through them to make it easier to find candidates. But some of these companies have reported that these systems started being discriminatory towards women and people of color without even being asked to. I feel like I'm getting riled up again. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is these generative AI bots such as ChatGPT. And she has an interesting perspective that I hadn't really heard of. Obviously, we know that they're not always accurate and they can hallucinate and spew false facts, but it's interesting how this can be harmful towards women. In an example she gave, there was a men's rights movement in Australia, and they made up this statistic about men's suicide due to the stress of going through child custody battles. That fact that they used to push their cause was eventually proved wrong. It was just an incorrect fact. But by that point, it had been told to people so many times that it had sort of become ingrained in the way people talk when it comes to these custody cases. And to this day, people still talk about men's suicide when mums are fighting for their children. So she goes and asks ChatGPT about this, and it comes back with a really long answer, agreeing with what she said and also giving an example of a man to who this happened to. And then when she goes back to ask if this statement was true or not, the chat just comes back with this paragraphs of apologies because it hadn't fact checked and it had just created this incorrect fact. So it apologizes for stating this as fact without cross-checking if it was actually true. And she kind of wondered about the amount of times that this happened and how many times these incel men get facts given to them that are just perpetuating their thoughts about women that are just incorrect. I was almost done. I'm back for another update because I've done quite a lot of reading since we last spoke, and I think I left my last update very abruptly. Like, I didn't really finish that update because Joel got home and then we had to leave pretty quickly to go out that night. So sorry if that seemed a bit strange, but since checking in, I have finished 2 audiobooks. The first one was The Elements of Marie Curie by Dava Sobel, and I was pretty excited for that one because I've heard a little bit about Marie Curie and how she is like a pioneer in terms of women in science, and just how much she did not only for science but also for women in science and the women who learnt from her over the years. So a quick summary on Marie Curie. She is a 2 times Nobel Prize winner, and she was also the first woman to ever win a Nobel Prize. She discovered the elements polonium and radium, and she coined the term radioactivity. So in this book, we kind of go into depth around her life before science, from her childhood, how she grew up, to her marriage and relationships. We kind of go through each of her big scientific discoveries, and we learn a bit about her daughters, their lives, and we also go quite into depth into the different women who worked alongside Marie and who were trained in her lab and who themselves had really great scientific careers because of that. So I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit disappointed by this one. I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would, and I ended up rating it 3 stars. Like I said before, I had heard a lot about Marie Curie being a really impressive woman in science, and so I was really excited for this one. But just something about the way it was told felt a bit textbooky. Like, it was just a bit unemotional, a bit dense, and at times, this is going to sound stupid, but a little bit too sciencey. I obviously knew there was going to be science involved, but she just goes into so much detail about each experiment, and we spend like too much time sometimes delving into those experiments when I just wanted to learn more about her, which we do get as well. We get her story, but the whole thing just kind of felt like a list of facts rather than an interesting story. And we never really got the author's opinions on anything. It was just kind of like, this is what happened. Which is fine, I kind of get it, but it just wasn't the most entertaining thing to read. Either way, I did love learning some interesting facts about science and about Marie and about her daughters. I especially loved the start where we're learning about Marie's upbringing in Poland. And it was at the time when the country was under Russian rule, so her parents really had to fight to get them into education. They had to be in these secret schools. And there obviously was a little bit of feminism in this as well, because even though Marie, so impressive and eventually was recognized for her work, just within this book, there were so many examples of how these impressive women, whether it's Marie or these other women who worked with her, had been put down by men at the time. and by society. For example, Marie's accomplishments were always joint with her husband's until he died. He would receive all of the letters for any accomplishments that she made at any speaking events where they were talking about their work. Pierre, her husband, would always be the one to speak. In one instance, Marie was even barred from attending the event because she was a woman. She was often seen merely as his wife, and despite having 50-50 contributions to their work, many people saw her just as his assistant, which is so frustrating. And obviously, as we know, over time, this did get better over the span of her career, and after he dies, she becomes a lot more well respected. But even then, she is often the only woman in the room at some of these events. And then apart from Marie, we also learn about some of the other women who studied with her and their stories. And in many of the stories, they had to choose between love or work. If they did choose love, if they choose to get married, it would often end their careers. For example, in a lot of US colleges at the time, there would be these promising women in science who are professors, and most of the time they'd just be fired from their jobs as soon as they'd get engaged to be married. In one woman's example who ends up moving to Paris to study with Marie, she gets engaged and then she is told by the dean of the school she works at that either marriage will distract you from your teaching job and as a result you won't be a good teacher, or your teaching job will distract you from your marriage. And that's not the kind of woman we want working here. So that is infuriating. Thankfully, this didn't really happen to Marie, and she was able to forge forward with her career while getting married, even working with her husband and having children. But it was infuriating to read about all of these examples of how the society at the time really didn't help these women with their ambitions. One thing I did want to note about the book, I saw quite a few negative comments on Goodreads after reading it about the fact that the author left off Marie's Polish maiden name from the title, which is Slodowska, which apparently was the name that she decided to use after her husband died. So a lot of those comments were sort of saying that this author is obviously monetizing off of Marie's name and her career, but without respecting her Polish background. I will note that in my experience of reading the book, I did feel like the author spent a good amount of time on discussing Marie's upbringing as a Polish girl and about her family who had to work really hard to make sure that all of their kids were well educated. So I did see the author highlighting her Polish origins, but I'm not sure if that was enough. Another thing that I noticed is that Curie, one of her daughters, wrote a book about her after she died, and that was titled Madame Curie. So I don't really know where I land on that discussion, but I'm obviously not Polish, so I don't really think I get an opinion. I just wanted to put that out there. And overall, I didn't have the best reading experience with this one. It wasn't the most fun, but I did learn a little bit, and I did still love reading about Marie, how ahead of her time she was, and just how much she helped other women in science. A solid, informative, 3-star non-fiction read. And then right after I finished that one, I started It's Not Hysteria by Tang. And the title of this one is Everything You Need to Know About Your Reproductive Health. This was a very interesting read. I actually think this is an essential read for all young women. But just like many in this video, it was deeply angering at times and an interesting listen for anyone who's interested in women's health at all. While reading, I couldn't help but compare this one to the first book that I read for this video, which was All in Her Head. They have a lot of similarities. Obviously, they're both about women's healthcare, and this one did have a little bit of similarities in the way that it talks about the history of women's health, but I found that this one took a much more practical and informative view on the female body, and it kind of gave information on what to do if you're suffering from specific problems, whereas the last one was focused more on society. and the things that have happened in our history and the reasons why things are the way that they are now. And yeah, obviously they were both written by female doctors. Karen Tang is a gynecological surgeon. I liked that this one had really practical information on healthcare issues that people are suffering with, such as endo, PCOS, all the different kinds of birth control, information on abortion, and just overall learning about our bodies and how to deal with any issues that we might have. I also really liked that very, very early on in the book, she states really clearly that she is an ally to transgender people and LGBTQI+ people. She talks about her intent in using gender inclusive language throughout the book because transgender men and non-binary people who were assigned female at birth obviously have gynecological issues as well. And as a doctor, she often has to care for transgender people. From her work, she talks about how sadly there is almost no research done for these people, but she obviously does want to do her best to help them in her line of work and to also be respectful when talking in this book. So that was very early on in the book. And then later on in the book, she has a whole chapter dedicated to gender, learning the difference between gender and sex, the difference between cis and non-binary people, a whole lot of information around healthcare issues that transgender people often face. And I really liked that she talked about the true and false narratives that are out there. For example, the myths around gender transitions and the ways that doctors can often treat gender dysphoria, which often happens in minors who are going through puberty, without needing to do surgeries until they reach adulthood. So yeah, I really, really liked this chapter. I felt like it would be so helpful for so many people out there. So another chapter is all about hysteria. Obviously the title of the book is It's Not Hysteria, and I learned a little bit about the backgrounds of the word hysteria and the way that it was used in our society in All in Her Head. Again, some similarities between them. And in this one as well, she talks about how it was essentially treated as a medical condition and how this has caused confusion now about what is myth and what is truth when it comes to women's health. I can't remember if I said this in my first update, but I'm pretty sure this was in the other book too. But even the word hysteria comes from an ancient Greek word for uterus. So even the origins of the word have been tied to women. Another chapter that I really appreciated was just simply getting to know the different parts of a woman's body. She goes into detail about what every part does, how they connect, their role in the menstrual cycle, as well as how to identify issues with your menstrual cycle or just other health problems. I think especially this part would be helpful for any teenage girl to read. It felt to me, I'm not sure, obviously I don't know every single healthcare issue out there, but it felt like she covered anything that I could think of. And I feel like if anyone has any doubts in their head about what they could be experiencing, that they should give this a listen. An issue that the author of All in Her Head touched on a tiny little bit, but probably not enough, and that we got a lot more information on in this book, is racism in the health industry and racism in the lack of medical research that we have and how this has affected how Black women are often treated. An example of this is the amount of pain medication that Black women receive. As for a long time, they've been seen to have a higher pain tolerance than white women, which is just simply not true and has no basis in scientific fact. But to this day, people still believe that Black women don't feel as much pain as white women. This is an important fact because of how serious this can be. Like, she gave a statistic about, I think it was like Black women are 3 times more likely to die while giving childbirth in the US, and the rate was even higher in the UK because medical professionals aren't taking their pain seriously. And these studies took into consideration socioeconomic differences. There were other things, but yeah, it was infuriating me, some of these facts. Also really liked and appreciated that at the end of every chapter she gave these little wrap-ups to basically summarize all of the important facts. And since so much information was often given in these chapters, it was really helpful. Overall, I found this one to be a really good information handbook, and it could be a little bit dense and information heavy at times, but I didn't mind because I just felt that information was so important. So yeah, definitely go in knowing that it's going to be less of an entertaining read and just really helpful for a lot of people. It did kind of get me thinking about my own body and the fact that it's something that I think about every now and then, that I've been on the pill since I was 17 or 18, so over 10 years at this point. And, you know, I've heard about women having really positive experiences of coming off the pill, sort of finding their emotions a bit more and learning their cycle. But on the other hand, I have heard of negative experiences and negative symptoms. So I do wonder, when it finally comes time to doing it, what I would be like as a person, if it would change my personality at all, or what could happen in terms of, you know, the symptoms that people talk about. Because I am almost 30 and I've never experienced being an adult not being on the pill, which is kind of wild. And I just wonder if my personality would be different. But the author did kind of make me feel better about the fact that the pill does work for some people, and I feel like I hear a lot of negativity about it, and it's often made me wonder if I'm doing the right thing for my body by being on it for so long. And she kind of put it in a medical way where it's just something that it doesn't work for some people and it does work for others. So I think I'm okay. But yeah, it brought up a lot of thoughts in my mind about myself, obviously. So that was It's Not Hysteria, and I have already picked the next book that I want to read. It's on my Kindle. So I've already downloaded on my Kindle. It's Positive Obsession, The Life and Times of Octavia E. Butler. And this one's by Susana M. Morris. And I'm really excited about this one. I don't know too much about Octavia Butler. The little that I do know is that obviously she is a science fiction author who is often labelled as a genius for her work. And I really, really do want to read some of her science fiction books. I've heard such good things about Kindred, and I think it's the Parable series, Parable of the Sower, I've heard a lot about, and they just sound like really interesting reads which talk a lot about the society that she lived in, politics, but in a way, in a science fiction-y kind of way, sometimes in a dystopian world, sometimes in outer space. And the only other thing that I've heard of about her is her crazy writing schedule. I think because for a lot of her career, she was struggling with money. So she still had to keep up these full-time jobs, often in factories. And so she would get up at like 2 or 3 a.m. to start writing every single morning. So that is just insane and extremely inspiring. So I am very excited to give this a try, and I'll check in as soon as I have some thoughts on Positive Obsession. Hi again. I just wanted to come on and do another little bit of an update because since I last spoke to you, I finished reading Positive Obsession by Susana M. Morris. This was such an interesting read. I ended up rating it 4 stars, and I really enjoyed learning about Octavia's life and her career and the issues that she faced through her life. So this was a biography, and it was written about Octavia E. Butler, who was one of our greatest women sci-fi writers. And she was one of the first Black female writers to publish in the science fiction genre. It was a sad read at times because she was born into a world that often failed and sometimes still fails to this day to recognize a Black woman genius. Despite this, and despite the fact that she didn't really have any direct models for the life that she wanted to lead, she made a life for herself as a writer and later on a teacher and a mentor. You can see how the author was really impacted by Octavia's works. She just seemed so passionate with the way that she talks about her and about her writing. After reading some of her descriptions on the books, I am so excited to read some of Octavia Butler's sci-fi novels, especially just after hearing her descriptions about them. I would definitely like to get to some of them soon. The title Positive Obsession has a pretty cool double meaning. The words positive obsession come from a quote from one of her most famous books, Parable of the Sower. But also, when she was alive, Octavia herself called her her deep desire to write and to share her works a positive obsession. Something that I felt like this book did so well was talking about the cultural, social, and historical context surrounding Octavia and how it shaped her as a person and shaped her views on the world, and they influenced her ideas that ended up being her books. She talks about what drove Octavia's passion: the civil rights movement, Black power, women's liberation, and queer rights. It was really interesting reading about Octavia's thoughts on politics at the time and the current events that were always happening around her at the different times of each novel. In her books, she writes about different versions of the future, always with Black women as the main characters. And those women are always tough, flawed, intelligent characters who are often well-rounded and complicated people. She also had a lot of thoughts on where society is heading in politics, and even after she dies, these thoughts live on in her books. It's really interesting. Her Parable of the Sower series, which I'm so excited to read, according to the author, almost predicted Trump. In the book, a man who is running for president calls himself a white Christian nationalist who is openly racist and whose slogan is something like "Make America Great Again," very similar to Trump's slogan. And Octavia died in 2006. So how did she know that by 2016 this would be the world that Americans were facing? The author basically says that she had studied enough history and studied the world that she was living in to have an idea where the world and politics were heading. Throughout the book, there were some really cool facts that I learned about her. So interesting. It was a really bad science fiction movie that she watched at age 12, which originally ignited her creative spark. And she first started creating some of her earlier science fiction works at that age. Some of the other things, it was really sad to learn about how even through a lot of her career when she was receiving critical acclaim and you'd think that she had made it, at the same time she was still having to work multiple factory jobs and was struggling financially. A lot of the source from the author's information in this book has come from Octavia's personal diaries, and it's sad. They reveal poverty, isolation a lot of the time, and her frustration at her situation and the world, but through this she continues to write. She even had to publish one of her books called Survivor much earlier than she wanted to, and before it was probably finished, because she needed the advance from that book to be able to keep writing her next novel. So when thinking back on that book, she was really unhappy with how that one came out. It was also so interesting to learn that in the author's opinion, Octavia was neurodivergent and her struggles as a kid in school. This obviously wasn't a known term at the time that Octavia was in school, and so schools just weren't equipped at that time. And so instead her teachers would call her lazy and undisciplined, and this really followed her all throughout her life. Because of these opinions that were put on her at a young age, she was always really hard on herself, and she struggled with what she perceived to be as her low productivity. But I also liked learning a lot about her personality and how she was a solo writer and she had a small group of family and friends, but she spent most of her time alone. She was very introverted but not unfriendly, and pretty much everyone who has personally encountered her called her kind, generous, and yeah, she just sounded like a great person. The saddest part about the books was her health problems that she battled with in her last decade of life. She had heart problems, high blood pressure, and as a result was taking medication that had side effects that were sometimes worse than her original illnesses. Again, while I was reading this, I feel like I was relating things to some of the things that I learned from All in Her Head, the first book that I read for this video. She was a black woman who was battling with health issues in the late 1900s to early 2000s, and she just wasn't getting the proper health care that she needed, leading to her early death in her 50s. But I love that the author talks about how her legacy kind of lives on in so many ways, because even after her death, she gets inducted to the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. Some of her most popular books get graphic novel adaptations, and I think at least one of her books now has a movie or TV adaptation. Even NASA named something after her. So I just feel like if she knew what kind of legacy she had left, she'd be so happy. I think probably my only negative, which is kind of a personal thing with this book, is that in a lot of parts throughout the book, the author goes really quite in depth into some of her books and into the themes behind them, which was so interesting. But I hadn't read the books yet, and I feel like I would have enjoyed these parts way more after reading her books, and I could relate a bit more the themes that she's bringing up to the stories that happen in her books. It just sometimes felt a little bit too long in these parts, and it went a little bit too much in detail. I wouldn't mind going back and reading her analysis on some of these things after I've read the books. I feel like maybe in the description for this biography there could have even been a spoiler warning for Octavia's most popular books. I know they've been out for so long at this point, but surely some people are reading this with the intent of wanting to learn a bit more about Octavia and then read her books after learning about her, because she goes really in detail into the plot of each of her books, and even to some extent reveals the endings. I get why, because she's talking about these real life things that were happening in Octavia's life and comparing them to the moral dilemmas that the characters were having in the book. But yeah, kind of giving away the ending was a little bit annoying to me, and I had to kind of skim these parts a little bit to try and avoid finding out what happened at the end. But that was just a small thing. I overall did really enjoy my time with this book, and as someone who didn't know very much about Octavia going in, I would say I have absolutely been turned into a huge fan of her, and yeah, I'm very excited to read all of her books. It's so impressive as well when you think about how she had to suffer as I think dyslexic girl in school when the system wasn't at all equipped to help her, and where she got to in life and in work, and some of her views on politics and feminism and her fears on where humanity is heading, and how she took all of those themes and put them into these really entertaining sci-fi and fantasy books. She just must have been extremely intelligent, and I was so impressed by her. Overall, this was an easy read and it never felt too information heavy or boring. So I enjoyed it and I gave it 4 stars. I have also chosen my final read for this video, and that's an audiobook that I already have ready from the library on my Libby, and that is Educated by Tara Westover, and that one's a memoir. So I'll talk a little bit about what that's about in my next update, but I'm excited to get to that one. This is my final update for the video because I've just finished Educated by Tara Westover. It has taken me a whole month, like the whole month of March, to finish these 5 books. At the start of the month, I had the goal that I wanted to read through at least 5 or so of the books on that Goodreads list written by or about like powerful women, and I have finally finished all 5 of them. So I'm pretty proud of myself that I got through them all, but it did take me a whole month. As I was making my way through this list, one thing I did notice is that pretty much the majority of the books on the list were either written by or about Americans. So I would like to read from some Australian women, and I think that's going to be a bit of a goal for me over the next few months, just to read some non-fiction that's either set or by Australians. But I'm so glad that I read Educated. This was a 5-star read. I loved it. Loved might be the wrong word, because it could be really heavy at times and it was really, really sad, but it was just done so beautifully. This was a memoir written by Tara Westover, and her writing is just so beautiful, and the way she put it together, it was just so easy to read. And this was definitely my favorite of all of the books that I read for this video. I listened to the audiobook and it was also narrated by... I've just had to move my car because there was just this group of kids being so annoying, and the park that I found is so dark, so sorry if the lighting's a bit weird now. But yeah, the audiobook was narrated by Julia Whelan, who is pretty much one of my all-time favorite audiobook narrators, and she did this so well. I would 100% recommend listening to the audiobook. And so if you don't know, Educated is a memoir written by Tara Westover about her own life, and she grew up in a Mormon family who lived in this remote town in Idaho. They lived like at the base of a mountain on this kind of like farm, and she had 6 siblings and a dad who had these radical Mormon views about things like no schooling, no hospitals or doctors, women being extremely modest, very outdated kind of views. And he's also scared of the world ending, so they spend like their entire summers canning fruits and just preparing for the apocalypse, which he is certain is coming. It's really sad. He is abusive to his children and to Tara's mum, and he clearly has some kind of mental health, bipolar disorder, which Tara does relate back to him when she eventually gets an education. She goes to college and she learns about that word for the first time. He would often just snap at the littlest things and become extremely violent and angry. And her mum is pretty horrible too. She's not abusive, but she just lets it happen, and she gets brainwashed as well over the years, and she just becomes worse and worse. to Tara. It is interesting, there's a part where Tara talks about her mum's story and how she left her kind of more affluent family who lived in the town to be with this kind of mountain guy who is different from everyone else in this small town. And it's just really sad because I don't think she realized what she was getting herself into, and she ends up in this horrible and violent relationship. Her story is sad, but I don't feel sorry for her when it comes to her children, because she just sits back and watches them get mistreated over and over again. She is the one that ends up giving Tara the little things in her teenage years that end up being really big for her. For example, she helps her get into dancing and then singing when she figures out that that's something she's talented at, and eventually the school musical at the local school. And these activities end up being quite life-changing for Tara and for her development and just for getting out of the house. So we follow Tara from growing up in this violent and sexist household and getting homeschooled, which actually meant no education at all, and pretty much just being forced to do manual labor every day with their dad. And then we see her growing up a little bit, becoming a teenager, getting interested in different hobbies and in boys, and then eventually figuring out for herself that she wants to learn and she wants to get an education. Despite having pretty much no education through her entire childhood and teenage years, she ends up leaving home at 17 to go study in Utah. And it's pretty wild. Through this, she ends up being so smart that she finds her way over to England and ends up studying at Cambridge University, which is so impressive. But yeah, her home life was definitely pretty tough. As I said, she was forced to do manual labor for pretty much her entire time that she's living at home. And sometimes the work that her and her brothers would be doing could become really dangerous, mainly because their dad didn't care at all about his kids' safety, and there were no precautions in the things that they were doing. So they would get these like really serious injuries, and then obviously because he didn't believe in hospitals or proper medicine, they would just have to suffer without any pain relief. It was pretty barbaric to listen to, especially when sometimes there would be these really serious head injuries that would just go unchecked. And I think the saddest part about the book were watching Tara's brothers growing up and becoming these toxic and abusive men as well. Well, especially one of her other brothers ended up leaving home quite young and going to get an education, and at that time Tara felt abandoned. But when she eventually grows up and does the same thing, he comes back into her life, which is nice. But her brother Sean had the worst story to read about. He was basically her best friend through their younger teenage years, but then over the course of multiple head injuries that he gets that go untreated, and his constant brainwashing from his dad about his views and respect for women, he eventually starts to become pretty deranged and abusive and manipulative towards the women he dates, but also towards Tara. He gets his dad's views on women's modesty, and he starts being pretty violent towards Tara when she starts becoming interested in boys or trying to dress a bit nicer, which really just meant not being covered in mud all the time. It was really awful seeing what he became. It was really, really great seeing her eventually get out and slowly start to get an education. It's difficult at first for her because she's so unsocialized, and living at college is a huge deal, and she has to overcome a lot of difficulties in that time. But it was so nice to see her learning about things like feminism and realizing just how wrong some of the views that her dad has ingrained in her really are. But it's also in these parts where some of that brainwashing and manipulation that she's had to deal with really come out in the form of her mental health. It's in some of the small things like when she gets her first boyfriend and she's having these migraines and he's trying to give her pain medication to help her, and she just refuses because of the brainwashing that her mum has told her about medication all her life. And then when she's a little bit older and her family eventually disown her, she falls into this really bad depression. And it's so sad. They're horrible to her. They basically manipulate her into thinking that the whole situation is her fault, and she kind of needs to remind herself of the physical and emotional abuse that she's been through all her life. But then you see in her head, she starts to tell herself that it wasn't that bad, that she imagined some of the things that happened to her. It's really sad to see the spiral that she goes down. But obviously she picks up herself and she becomes this really well-educated woman who goes to Cambridge and eventually has written this book. And it's really emotional when I think about how beautifully written the book is, how easy to read it is, and the fact that she didn't step foot into a classroom until the age of 17 and she's created this is pretty overwhelming. So that was Educated by Tara Westover. I loved it, 5 stars. And I'm so happy that I finished reading all of the 5 books about and written by strong women. As I said, this did take me a lot longer than I expected to get through, but I'm proud that I finished them all, and I think I learned a lot over this time. So I'm excited to get back into some fiction books. I obviously kind of have been throughout the month as well. I didn't just stick to reading these non-fiction books, but I have some fantasy books that I am so excited to get to, and I really need to get to my autumn TBR that I put together. But this video has definitely got me keen to keep reading non-fiction books every now and then. I think my goal is going to be that I should try to read at least one non-fiction book per month moving forward. I think I was really lacking in this genre over the last few years, and I've loved learning about all these different topics. It's been really great. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, then please give this video a like and please consider subscribing. Thanks again for being here, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.